Kokomi is the single best character in Genshin Impact right now, is what I'd like to say. She has an amazing design coupled with a pretty sweet kit. And what other characters are there that let you summon a jellyfish and do mermaid flips to attack? I don't know, that might not appeal to everybody, but I think it's pretty cool. And as Spiral Abyss usage rates have stayed actually fairly high for Kokomi, it makes me think that a lot of people appreciate her too. But it wasn't always like this, so today I want to talk about how Kokomi's role has changed as new patches in Genshin Impact have come to pass. And at the end of the video, let me know what you think, and also let me know if you're going to be pulling for Kokomi on her upcoming rerun. With all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Kokomi. First off, you know this, I know this, Kokomi sales suck. They were really low, not a lot of people were rolling for her. It was really strange to see a character that was so hyped up on social media end up not performing that well. Kokomi was released months ago and is the least owned limited 5-star in all of Genshin Impact. In some way that makes Kokomi havers like shiny Pokemon. But why did Kokomi not sell? Well, first off, she was right after Raiden's banner, the current highest selling banner in Genshin history. It's likely that players were either out of Primogems or expendable income. But on top of that, initially the Genshin community's impressions of Kokomi were not so great, and with sound reasoning too. Kokomi is a Hydro Catalyst healer, similar to Barbara as a healer and similar to Mona as a Hydro Catalyst. But unfortunately for Kokomi, Mona does a ton of damage, so it's hard to justify replacing her. And though Kokomi's healing potential is very good, her being the cost of a 5-star made people wonder why not just use Barbara? And on top of that, though Kokomi has great off-field Hydro application, it's not consistent enough to make it worth running her in teams utilizing Pyro carries like Hu Tao, Diluc, or Yoimiya. So where does that leave Kokomi? She's a Hydro healer that doesn't deal as much damage as other units that you could use in her place, and can't be slotted into many teams as a best choice. Well, as do seasons, metas change. Characters change, enemies change, Spiral Abyss changes, and public opinion does as well. They don't change literally since characters' kits aren't usually adjusted once they're released, but in the context of how good they are perceived to be, there is no static placement. Let me explain. Kokomi has typically been seen as a bad unit by the part of the community who prefers meta over waifu, and their claims about her damage being low aren't necessarily wrong. For the same investment, you can often get a ton of damage dealers to deal better damage than Kokomi, even if they're not a top unit. And with a Spiral Abyss that keeps getting more and more difficult with higher DPS checks, high damaging units are becoming increasingly more important. At the end of the day, most people aren't using Kokomi as a DPS, even though her burst implies that she should deal solid damage. And you could call it solid damage, but it's not game-changing by itself. Keywords being by itself, because Kokomi's role in dealing damage has changed. But we'll talk about that in a minute. First, we need to address Kokomi's role as a support. As mentioned previously, a lot of the community didn't think Kokomi would be a solid pick over units like Barbara or Mona, since both of those units bring similar or more value per investment. Mona deals high damage and applies Hydro well for freeze, whereas Barbara can output strong heals, create a Hydro aura around you, and be a solid noblesse user to buff your team. What does Kokomi bring to the table? Heals, Hydro application, and looking really cool. As of 2.4, 2 new artifact sets were released though. Those sets are the Husk and Clam sets. The Husk set would go on to become the go-to defense set, whereas the Clam set would sort of float. Clam is a strong set that converts overhealing into raw physical damage, which ended up buffing some lesser used characters like Barbara and Chi-Chi, who weren't played as healers super often because of their low damage, or at least while off the field. But how does this affect Kokomi? Well, for some players, it actually doesn't. Kokomi has a few sets that are commonly used for her, these being Heart of the Depths for DPS Kokomi players, Tenacity of the Millilith for support Kokomi players, and now Clam for players looking to squeeze more damage out of Kokomi off the field. Was the Clam set actually a buff for Kokomi though? Well, as it turns out, it completely depends on the damage output of your team. In some cases, Tenacity of the Millilith's attack buff will beat out the extra damage from Clam Kokomi. The other benefit of Tenacity of the Millilith is that you don't have to invest in Kokomi at all to get the most out of its effect. But it is still worth acknowledging that the Clam set gave Kokomi a new playstyle for players who heavily invest into her, and that's what the Clam set brought to the table. Now, was the new artifact one of the things that brought Kokomi to higher usage rates? I'm sure there was a small change. We have no way to actually tell, but we can assume that a small portion of the people continuing to use Kokomi or new players using Kokomi were more interested in her once they found out they could proc damage while she's off the field using the Clam set. It's exciting to think about building full heals and still dealing damage. But what else changed about Kokomi? Well, like I said before, nothing changed about Kokomi specifically, but the circumstances players found themselves in the newest content changed how much she was used by people who had her. For a decent amount of time, miHoYo has been releasing enemies that are meant to discourage running shields while encouraging the use of strong healers. Rift Wolves are one example since they have pretty high HP stats and take a while to defeat, and while they don't do much damage on their own, they apply a damage over time effect to your entire team that hits through shields. Can you think of any characters that have solid healing over time and a tool to heal the entire team very quickly? I mean, I can think of a few, but Kokomi would be the most recently added one and definitely one of the best characters at performing that function. On top of that, there were Abyss cycles using corrosion without Rift Wolves being on every floor at once, and with the addition of the new Pyro Elector, it sort of feels bad not to have a Hydro unit, especially in this Spiral Abyss. In fact, the current Abyss cycle as of making this video feels like it was made for Kokomi, since the first and second floor 12 chambers feel like they need entirely different teams, while Kokomi can be fit into either team you would use for those floors to clear easily. Considering how heavily miHoYo has been shifting Spiral Abyss and the enemy types you're seeing around the world, it's safe to say that they want you to use Kokomi. Maybe this is an anticipation for the upcoming Kokomi rerun since she didn't sell well. But all of that, what we just spoke about, is just another reason Kokomi started seeing more play. There's actually one more thing that we haven't touched on though, and that's top teams for Kokomi. Generally, when people think about Kokomi, they're thinking about freeze. They're not thinking about anything that's going to do massive damage from Kokomi herself. And that's because Kokomi just isn't a top tier damaging unit. In terms of stats, she falls short of a lot of characters, including other Hydro options, but she can fill similar roles to other top units while providing some value. For example, in a Child driver team with Xiangling and Bennett, Kokomi can replace Child to help Xiangling vaporize consistently. Will the damage be as good as Child? Not really, but it's solid at the end of the day. It's enough to clear Abyss. On top of that, one of the most important findings with Kokomi was Sukokumon, or Sucrose Kokomi Pokemon. The Pokemon in this team are Kokomi's Jellyfish, Fischl's Oz, and Xiangling's Squoba, with Sucrose there to swirl and debuff enemy resistances while also dealing decent damage. Sukokumon solidified itself as one of the best teams for Abyss a few cycles ago, and has remained consistently good and one of the only teams in Genshin Impact that needs Kokomi for her healing as well as her off-field Hydro application. Now, to be completely transparent, I won't pretend to be an expert on Sukokumon, but from what I do know about the team, it has a very specific order in which you need to attack and use abilities to reach its damage ceiling that makes it one of the top teams. The reason it has this specific rotation is because Sukokumon deals with a ton of reaction damage that is set up in a very specific way to reach insane damage outputs. To some theory crafters like Teraflop, this was a challenge to figure out if you could take one of the worst characters in the game, or at least what people thought to be one of the worst characters in the game, and make them meta, which as a result made Kokomi a part of the meta at that time. And if you want to learn the specific rotation for it and take your gameplay to the next level, I'd suggest you check out 1010's video since he covered it pretty in depth. That being said, Sukokumon conceptually ends up being very strong even without the exact rotation to make it hit its max potential. And for this reason, Kokomi saw a lot more play for the few players that had access to her. Fast forward to 2.4, almost 2.5, and Kokomi is still considered by a fairly large portion of the community to be a bad unit. And to be completely honest, these players wouldn't be completely wrong if miHoYo hadn't pushed the game in the direction of making shields useless and heals necessary to clear content. But because of that shift in enemies, a new artifact set being added to buff healers, and theory crafters doing what they do best, Kokomi has actually established herself as a solid unit in current content. Now, am I saying that Kokomi is amazing and you must pull for her? Not at all. Kokomi is a solid unit in general for the utility she provides to freeze teams with her Jellyfish, as well as her healing and extra damage or buffs from artifacts. She also can buff your team with the weapon Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers that shares a huge amount of attack after swapping. She has a lot of uses, but she also is a highly used unit right now due to circumstance. As we approach Sumru and a new meta becomes more prevalent, older characters will fall off. And this doesn't just include Kokomi, this applies to tons of units released during the Inazuma patches. And part of the reason this doubly affects Kokomi is because miHoYo had to shift the meta entirely to get Kokomi to see a lot more play. And it's likely that if we go back to shield meta that Kokomi's not going to see much play. But that being said, Kokomi will likely remain a decent unit at low investment due to the support utility she provides, since healing will almost always be necessary in high-end content, unless you're some kind of esports gamer god messiah with the reflexes of Kirito from SAO. Ultimately, Kokomi as a unit hasn't changed, but her value and place in the meta has, and as a result, she is able to be seen in a much better better light than before. With her rerun banner coming up, a lot of players will be pulling for her, and though many members of the community will urge against using your hard-earned Primogems for her, it cannot be denied that Kokomi, at least for the past couple of patches, has been a much more useful unit than she was during her initial release. As a result, pulling her on her rerun banner is safer than it used to be as well. If you're on the edge about Kokomi, you won't be missing out on a top unit by skipping her, but don't let naysayers stop you from rolling for her if you decide that you want her for your teams. She's in a lot better of a place right now than she was during her release due to the state of the game and the enemies in it, and her shortcomings are often greatly exaggerated. And ultimately, she's not as bad of a unit as people make her out to be. If you guys have enjoyed, make sure to let me know down in the comments, and of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Genshin content, other game content as well in the future, and follow the Twitch if you're interested in live content. I'll be spam posting a bunch of Yai stuff soon, so stay tuned, and I will catch you guys next time. Thanks for listening. See ya.